Welcome back. The U.S. and Sweden signed a new defense pact this week as the Scandinavian country is now on the brink of joining NATO. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and his Swedish counterpart met at the Pentagon to sign the paperwork. It's going to allow the U.S. access to all military bases across Sweden and hedge against Putin's regime in Russia as his war in Ukraine rages on. Shannon spoke with the Swedish defense minister at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California just before he came here to D.C. to ink that deal.
So first and foremost, the conversation involving Sweden right now is about your entrance into NATO. It looks like objections from Turkey have fallen away, but you're waiting for the formalities of that. How critical is that for you all to join NATO at this point?
Well, I think it's critical for Sweden, of course, for our security to be covered by Article 5 and also NATO's common defense planning. But it's also very important for the alliance because we have assets and capabilities that can make NATO stronger. We also want to be integrated into NATO's regional plans. And if Sweden is in, it's of course easier to defend both Finland and the Baltic states because we can provide the alliance with strategic depth, and our territory can be used as a staging and basing area, which will make NATO stronger.
And you've said you weren't surprised about what Putin did and the lines that he's crossed and where he's gone with respect to Ukraine. Part of his objections, it seemed like back then, where he was worried about the growth of NATO. Yeah. And now it seems that the turn of events may have been that he's forced more nations into that very important alliance.
Yeah, I always say that the Swedish and Finnish NATO membership, that's the mother of all unintended consequences for Russian thinking. Russia did not see that Sweden or Finland would join the alliance, and this was not planned, but that's of course the consequences. And this war has been a political and military disaster for Putin.
You all are having the same conversations that we're having here in the U.S. about aid to Ukraine, about funding that. What is the sense like among the Swedish people about continuing forward with that aid and the level of what you're doing?
It's a great support in Sweden for continuing the support for Ukraine. And I always say supporting Ukraine is both the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. Because when we're supporting Ukraine, we're also investing into our own security. Because if Putin would win this war, we would have much bigger problems than just providing military arms to Ukraine and financially and politically and military supporting the Ukrainians. So this is really about investing into our own security as well.
What are your long-term fears about Putin, about this potentially spreading into a NATO country, which would then obviously trigger Article 5 and a lot of different obligations from members?
Well, I think you have to be aware that Russia has a great appetite for taking political and military risk. They have also stated they're going to reconstitute their armed forces, and they're going to try to build an even stronger armed forces than they have before the war. So we have to be aware of that, and the best way to do that is, of course, in joining NATO, which is great for deterrence and defense of the whole alliance, but also investing into our own armed forces. And Sweden has doubled our defense expenditures in just 5 years, and we will do more as well in making ourselves stronger. So that's really a key for our security.
What is the sense in the region about where Putin goes next? Do you think there is a settlement in which he, at any point, whether the Ukrainians fight back the land that they've lost, there's a diplomatic settlement? What do you see as the finish line for that conflict?
There's only one country where they can decide that. That's the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians want to regain the whole territory, waiting to the 1991 border, or if they want to stop negotiating, that's up to them. But there should not be any kind of decisions above the heads of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian armed forces now are doing something that's very difficult. They're going into these minefields. They're clearing mines at the same time as their incoming shells. And I understand that is hard and difficult for them, but they have the determination, and if they don't have war fatigue, we cannot have war fatigue.
And we're here as we're talking at the Reagan National Defense Forum, and there's a lot of talk here about alliances, about leadership, about international rule of law. Where would you assess that we are this moment in history with all of these various conflicts and real challenges for people who are about democracy and freedom?
Sure. This has been difficult times, and this has been challenges to rule of law. And let me just say that Sweden and Finland joining NATO, that's also about the rule of law, because before the war broke out in December, then Foreign Minister Lavrov presented a legally binding treaty saying that Sweden and Finland will not be allowed to join NATO, stating that Sweden and Finland were part of Russian sphere of influence. That's totally unacceptable. We are a sovereign country. we will make our own decisions on how to join NATO or not, of course, in good dialogue with the rest of the NATO allies. I think now we're a lot of challenges right now, of course, in the Middle East and what's happening in the Indo-Pacific with a much more assertive China, and then, of course, in Ukraine. But at the same time, the West has never been as united as we are right now. As far as EU and NATO has never cooperated as closely together. I think the US has shown a very inspiring leadership in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and we should build on this unity that's is very strong in the West.
You mentioned China, and obviously their influence is showing up globally in all kinds of different ways. What is the mood in Sweden with respect to China, your particular national security interests, and its influence expanding in the region?
It changed enormously during this decade. If you would have opinion polls 10 years ago, Sweden would have a rather favorable outlook on China. But now we're much more aware, of course, how China is throwing its weight around in the Indo-Pacific. We're also much more cognizant about some of the risk or unintended consequences of having foreign direct investment into our critical infrastructure. So we established new laws and regulations for that as well. Because we don't want to be in a situation where you're dependent on autocratic countries when it comes to your functionality or your national security.
And that's a conversation we're having here in the U.S. as well. Minister, thank you for your time.
Thank you.